I'd like to start with you, Isabella. You're a German economist, associate professor of economics at the University of Massachusetts, Amherst, and I think you just returned from the G20 summit in Brazil, if I'm right, and you are very known for advertising the German for advising the German government during the gas crisis. So yeah, maybe you can tell us first of all, where did you spend the election night and what were your first thoughts after the magic wall on CNN turned red?
Yeah, thank you. Thank you very much for having me, and thank you for organizing this. So I was, of course, shocked like everybody else, but I was not surprised. For me, the weeks before the election, in fact, the months since Kamala Harris came out with the announcement around price gouging legislation in the food sector and the massive backlash that she has experienced from economists, and then, of course, also the Trump campaign, which is very unsurprising, which ultimately led to her going mute on inflation, which was very clearly the most important question for voters already for a long time. So that at the end of the day, she didn't have a clear story how she would be addressing the most important concern of voters, the most important concern of voters in swing states, swing voters in swing states. I had been extremely concerned. I've been saying that it felt a little, you know, like when you have an accident and you already know that you are falling, and then there's this moment of slow motion before you hit the ground. The weeks before the election for me felt like that. So I was, of course, shocked like everybody else, but not surprised. I think that we have to have a serious reckoning with the role of economic experts in the context of the rise of the far right. I tweeted that night that we need to have a serious conversation about anti-fascist economics, and I meant it, that I think that we need to have a serious conversation. It's not that I have the silver bullets somewhere sitting in my drawer in Amherst, but I do think that we have to start thinking very seriously about how economics can be part of an attempt to stop the further rise of the far right, rather than ending up complicit in the ways in which too many economists, too many Democrat economists ended up being in the most critical moment on economic policy of Kamala Harris' campaign in August 2024. I think that the whole debate that we have had in the United States around vibesession, around the idea that people's repeated insistence in poll after poll after poll for years, that they are suffering real economic hardship due to inflation, and that even though headline inflation was coming down, they were still suffering hardship, and the majority of people was reporting that, and that the reaction of economists was to say, oh, this is just about vibes because GDP growth and unemployment numbers look great, and there is some catch up of real wages at the very bottom, where, of course, if we talk about a higher rate of growth of real wages at the bottom, where people might be making $12, if they suddenly make $18, they have a 50% wage growth, but they are still horribly poor in relationship to the prices of food, for example. So we need to have a real reckoning with the ways in which we deal with these kind of headline numbers. And I think that we really ought to move from lecturing people about how they don't understand their pocketbook economics to trying to understand what the real hardship is that people experience, be humble and question our methods, be prepared to go back to the drawing board if there is a massive mismatch between what people are saying in surveys, what people are saying in qualitative research, what people are saying in focus groups, what people are saying in interviews, and the headline numbers that we see. We have seen a bit of a similar kind of tendency in Germany, I will add, and I'm sorry if I'm so outspoken, but I think this is a moment where we have to be outspoken. I think we have to come clear. As far as I'm concerned, it's 5 to midnight. So I think we have had a serious similar kind of issue in Germany when economists insisted that there was not even a recession in early 2023, where others, like myself, but others were warning that we were at the edge of a deep economic crisis, and we were ridiculed as lobby economists for warning of the seriousness of the situation. And I think that this kind of downplaying of the crisis was critical in Germany in 2023 for the government to decide to not implement the debt brake, which was a critical step that then led to the judgment of the Supreme Court in Germany over the debt brake, the handling of the debt brake, which in many ways is the beginning of the end of the government, which is the beginning of the end of the Progress Coalition, which is the beginning of the end of any kind of coherent economic policy making that we have seen under the current government. So again, I think there was a lack of humbleness. I think there was a lack of willingness to take serious just how serious the situation is. And I want to add, and I know this might be provocative, but I think we have to be very careful in parading around and saying that we are against populism, because one reading of populism is, of course, that it is an economics that centers on the popular demands of common people. And I think ruling this out as part of a new paradigm is very dangerous in the current kind of situation. I'm as much a fan of Bidenomics as the next person. I'm as much a fan of the revival of industrial policy as the next person who signed the Berlin Declaration. But I think that at the end of the day, Bidenomics and the Inflation Reduction Act, which of course was a critical departure from Build Back Better, but Build Back Better was designed around centering on certain human needs, centering on certain communities, centering on good jobs. And a lot of, I mean, some of this made it into the IRA, but a lot of it got slashed. For example, also all the care provisioning that were meant to be in the IRA. So a lot of the things that would have been popular, if you want so, would have been populist, that would have catered to the needs of ordinary people in this moment of economic crisis, ended up not making it into the final legislation for political reasons, to be sure. But I think what ended up happening is that on the one hand, Bidenomics was the clearest departure from trickle-down economics that we have seen in the US in many years. I mean, as President Biden said many times himself, very explicitly, trickle-down economics is not good enough. But we got, in some sense, another version of like a state-led version of trickle-down economics, if you want so, because the focus was on the upstream sectors, on sectors that definitely need investment. I'm all in favor of this. But if the new paradigm is only about upstream technocratic projects and fixing some things deep down in the machinery of the economy, it will be extremely difficult to win the people back. That's why I think that we, on the one hand, need a new paradigm in fighting inflation, because it's very clear that inflation was the #1 economic issue that led to Trump's win. We need a form of economic policy disaster preparedness, because there will be more shocks to come. I mean, I'm coming back from Brazil. The stories about the floods in southern Brazil are just horrendous. So in that kind of environment that we are living in this moment of climate change, in this moment of extreme geopolitical confrontations, of rising numbers of conflicts, there will be more shocks. If with every shock we react by hiking interest rates, which with the explicit aim of some economists to throw people out of work, it will be extremely difficult to not go further down on the slippery slope of a movement towards something that I think can be described as extreme right, if not worse. So in that context, really a plea to say that this new paradigm, or this work on new paradigm, I think has to take people's concerns seriously and not be a new technocratic project that is detached from the sentiments that we that we see and that we can follow in surveys and interviews. Thank you.
Thank you, Isabella, so much for your thoughts. It's very, very interesting. I'd like to hand over to Harold James. Harold James, you're an economic historian and you're focusing on German and European history. So you even have German roots, I learned, and now you're teaching in at Princeton University, and you just spent several months in Germany at the WCB and focusing on the history of modern markets. So I'm interested in your point of view on the election result, and especially what you think what Isabella just told us, what a new paradigm should look like.
So yes, thank you so much. It's great to be in this discussion, and I agreed very much with Isabel's focus that it does seem to me that there's very little doubt about the cause of the Trump election victory. It's not a massive election victory, but it's a substantial election victory. And it's striking, I think, how in every sector of the voting population, the support for Biden in 2020 was greater than that for Kamala Harris in 2024. So yes, it's about inflation, and it's about the legacy of inflation. That's absolutely critical. But it's also about a culture war story, and that was part of the election. And it does seem to me to be tragic that the Democrats in the United States are going to tear themselves apart now in the next few years in a kind of post-mortem exercise of what went wrong in 2024. I mean, my belief is really quite simple, that Joe Biden was an unsuitable candidate, and it would have been desirable to replace him earlier and to have a properly democratic process to replace him. And so the last-minute replacement and the fact that there was no real discussion in the Democratic Convention in Chicago was one of the things that gave, I think, the appearance that this was a kind of inside job, and that this was not responding to what Isabel correctly identified as people's sentiments and people's wish for a change. I mean, this is all over the world in 2024, that people are voting against incumbents, and there's a feeling of dissatisfaction. And yes, so there's a sense of wanting to have a very, very new paradigm. I think realistically, we need to think about what is going to happen over the next few months and years, and what the context then is for how we rebuild our approach to the economy, because we're going to see, I believe, a really quite radical experiment, and it's an experiment that I think is unlikely to go very well. So, you know, that's the first thing I would like to say. It's a big experiment. It's revolutionary in some ways, and many people in the incoming administration will talk about it as a revolution. But it's full of contradictions. And the contradictions, I think, are what we need to focus on. If we think about the inadequacies of the campaign for one moment again, let me just call your attention to the one television debate between ex-President Trump and Vice President Harris. So the television debate was largely unsubstantial, but there was one area where there really was a debate about policy towards the beginning of the session. And that, to my mind, is one of the areas where Vice President Harris made a mistake, miscalculated, because she rightly said that the Trump fiscal plans, shifting a lot of the tax revenue from the old taxes, from income taxes and capital taxes, to a tariff, was likely to impose a high cost on ordinary people and likely to push the prices up. So to do exactly what Isabel and I are both alarmed about. And so she laid that out very accurately. And then Donald Trump replied, well, he had put on some tariffs, famously in his administration, and also famously, the Biden administration had done very little to reduce them. And so they can't be that bad. And Kamala Harris was then left speechless at that proposition and didn't give an effective reply. And the answer is tariffs are, in the end, extremely costly, and they will affect the living standards of ordinary people. It's, I think, a little bit, though, like if you imagine for really radical tariff increases, 60% on China, more for Mexico as a threat to Mexico in order to deal with the question of migration. High tariff everywhere, focusing on bilateral trade deals. And so in that bilateralization of trade, so that's not the only kind of measure. So that's not the only kind of measure that is likely to be introduced. If you think of the other big headline measure and the concern, I think also of many voters, was about migration, and Trump pushed this right to the front of his campaign, and the proposal now to round up and then deport the many millions, we think maybe 11 million or so, undocumented workers, is also going to have an effect, very dramatic effect, on prices and on availability. So distribution centers, which handle the distribution of goods, are going to have a shortage of workers. Fruit picking is vegetable cultivation. All these things are going to be very difficult. There is actually a nice analogy with Brexit. Exactly this happened after Brexit in 2016. There was, I grew up in Cambridge in Britain, and north of Cambridge, there's this vast fruit growing area, and the fruit was rotting on the bushes and on the trees because there weren't any people there to pick it, because the people who'd come to do the picking had come from the European Union, were properly documented, but were then being pushed out. So we're going to get a cost increase there as well. If you take the appointment of Robert Kennedy seriously, and Robert Kennedy thinks that he's going to change the diet of the American population and change it in a healthier way, in many ways, this is a desirable development, but it's also going to be very much more costly if it's implemented. So how is this going to play out? Well, there's a big gamble, I think, and like any kind of successful political movement, what Trump put together is a coalition. It's a coalition of people who are worried about basic things like inflation, like immigration, like political correctness in schools, with people who have a radical vision of economic transformation. So if we're talking about new economic paradigms, one group of the Trump supporters, and we've seen them particularly in evidence over the last days since the election, is the Silicon Valley group. So you can't really see after the election a picture of Donald Trump without a picture of Elon Musk. And there's a very distinct vision of what is going to happen, which is that you apply technology in a big scale, and the tech platforms, big tech platforms, are intended to raise living standards, to make people better off, but also make people feel better off. There is evidence that this is possible. If you think of, for instance, the application of AI in healthcare, in care for the elderly, there's quite a deal of nice empirical work already that suggests that using AI applications is a way of increasing the productivity and hence the earnings of the least skilled workers. So the least skilled workers in various experimental settings, also various empirical settings where people have looked at this effect in, for instance, call centers, but also in care for the elderly. It's the least skilled that benefit most from these AI applications. And so you can see a ray of optimism there. But is this going to counter effect the massive increase in costs that you're going to get? I think it's extremely unlikely. And so you will see a whole series of really dramatic economic events unfolding. We're still in the middle of a big euphoric moment in the markets. They're pushed by this idea of technical transformation. That's what's fueling this. And then we will see how this plays out. We will expect also to see the dollar rising. The dollar has been one of the Trump trades, as has the cryptocurrencies, Bitcoin, Tesla, and so on. But this is one of the areas I think where you can learn something from historical incidents, their historical precedents, where people put together a coalition that's fundamentally incoherent, and the coalition then begins to disintegrate. You can see already signs of this disintegration in the current news, the internal turmoil about who the next Treasury Secretary will be. Will it be a conventional figure, or will it be somebody who is going to do much more of the paradigm shifting? So this I think is the really crucial area where we're likely to see a kind of disappointment and a tension. And above all, let me highlight the fundamental tension of this. The tech vision is fundamentally a global vision, and it depends on global communications, on thinking about services and goods that are traded all over the world. Just recently, somebody who looks like an ideological friend of Donald Trump and the new American administration, President Javier Milei in Argentina, reduced the tariffs in Argentina. And Elon Musk applauded that. It's difficult to see how that fits with Donald Trump's vision. So you're already beginning to see these tensions. They will be worked out, and it's I think not implausible to believe that this will be a deeply dysfunctional administration whose policies will result quickly in a profound backlash, and people will see in other countries not a model of how to do things, but a model of how not to do things. And that too is sometimes a useful case, a model of how not to do things when many, many features of the American economy and the American political system are fundamentally quite broken. Thank you.
Yes, I'd like to ask you, Isabella, because Howard just did such a dark outlook and talked about this big experiment that we are just noticing there. Why did the Democrats not get out the message, okay, Trump politics will make the cost of living even higher? So Harold just said it's about the tariffs. Those will increase the daily cost of living. The inflation will rise. The Fed has to react, and so on. The rates go up. So why couldn't Kamala Harris and the team not get through with this message? Okay, these are the real impacts of Trump.
Yeah, thank you. To be perfectly honest, I'm not even sure if they really tried. I think that on the economic policy front, the campaign ended up being very vacuous in many ways. Harris neither came out to defend forcefully the strong parts of Biden's legacy, nor did she manage to lay out a convincing alternative vision. So she was pondering this idea of an opportunity economy, but I think opportunity economy as a framing is, first of all, of course, extremely vague, and also can sound almost like a hubris for people who are struggling to pay their bills, who are struggling to pay exploding credit card interest rates, who are struggling to put food on the table, who are struggling with rent, who are no longer able to get a mortgage, who are no longer able to buy a house because of the high interest rates. If you then come along and make like vague promises around an opportunity economy, I think that is not a way to win people over. As regards the criticism of or the critiquing, the kind of the portrayal of Trump that the Democrats leaned onto, I think they very much leaned on the idea that he's a convicted criminal, which he of course is, that he will destroy democracy. So they kind of leaned into these ideas of this not being a morally fit person to run the US as a democracy, which I, of course, share this concern, but I think is not the strategy to win over voters. I will add one note of caution. So I generally fully agree with Professor James' analysis. I will just add that what we have seen in the first Trump term is that he was very willing to break with economic orthodoxy in ways that was beneficial for his own political stance. So, for example, the sending out of checks with a Trump signature on them, right? I mean, from the perspective of winning over people, it's a genius move, right? From the perspective of targeted economic policy, probably not so much. He also, ironically, of course, did issue an executive order on price gouging, which he then branded as communist price controls when Kamala Harris came out with her proposal. So what I'm trying to say is that while, of course, the analysis that was just presented is correct, I think we should not underestimate the willingness of the Trump administration to come out with extremely pragmatic kind of measures. And basically, I mean, a lot of what we are talking about here is a transition into a form of war economy, right? And of course, there is a rich history in the US of war economy kind of tools that President Trump, in his first term, did mobilize, not to its full extent and so on, but he did plug into that legacy. So, for example, as regards tariffs, I'm not saying they are going to do this. I'm just like giving an example of what I have in mind when I say I could see that they do very unconventional things. They could, for example, say that they slap a 100% tariff on Chinese imports, but then they put the burden on the exporters and say exporters cannot increase prices by more than X, and basically with a command and order type of intervention, make the exporters absorb some of this cost. Now, this will not work for all imports, but for some imports where the United States is the most important consumer market, there might be a scope where exporters would be basically forced to operate on extremely slim profit margins and absorb some of those tariffs. I'm not saying this is ideal. I'm saying this is pretty. I'm not saying they should be doing this. I'm not saying I'm in favor of those tariffs. I agree with everything that Professor James has said. I'm just saying I think we should not underestimate the willingness to do unconventional things that might change that might change the dynamic compared to what we imagine if we think of tariffs in a more conventional kind of environment.
Professor James, maybe for the last question, you can give us your opinion on Bidenomics, because Bidenomics' aim was to make the working class feel the government, once a person said. So why exactly did it fail?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I agree. I think there were many bits of the Bidenomics package that were really, in the end, had a long-term vision and were deeply desirable. And in particular, I think the Inflation Reduction Act and the long-term process of prompting investment in the green economy was exactly the right move. And what it did and what it's continuing to do is to drive down the price of green energy. And so this is very, very desirable, and it will create effect. And I think it's difficult. And yes, maybe the Trump administration will be pragmatic and it won't interfere in this. But what it failed completely at was the politics of it. A lot of the IRA jobs were deliberately created in either swing states or Republican-leaning districts. It was designed to show the Trump voters that a different paradigm worked, and it absolutely failed in doing that. In the same way, by the way, I think they learned something from the Trump tariffs, because the Trump tariffs also had no economic effect, but they had a political effect. They pushed the Republican support. And again, there's been some nice empirical study of this. But the fundamental flaw of Bidenomics, and I think it's the legacy of Donald Trump, and it's the legacy of exactly what Isabel talked about with the signatures on the checks. The idea was in 2020, as the COVID pandemic ravaged Americans, that you would give a massive fiscal support. And the extent of the fiscal support was overdone in 2020. It was overdone in the Biden years because the Biden people were worried about the midterm elections, about the 2024 elections. And it's the combination of a fiscal policy that was much too loose, and then of a monetary policy that reacted too late to that fiscal policy. And there's been a lot of self-criticism now. Jay Powell has reflected very, very self-critically on the Fed's slowness to raise rates. So the inflation is really pushed by a fiscal and monetary mixture that was learned from the great financial crisis or the Great Recession in 2008, when we had too little fiscal stimulus and too little and too late. And in this case, they overdid it, and they got the inflationary consequences. The disinflation was relatively painless in the sense that it didn't push up unemployment, but it had the bad political effects that inflationary episodes often, to my mind, almost always do have. And that was a extreme disconcerting of voters and feeling that the pocketbooks have been hit and that the economy is not well managed. So the mismanagement is not so much with the Inflation Reduction Act, but with the general fiscal stance and much too loose fiscal stance.
Okay, thank you so much to both of you for spending the spending the time on the afternoon here. Yeah, all the best to you. Thanks for the discussion, and yeah, good flight back, Isabella Weber.